Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Danube Institute, may I welcome you to this discussion of the recent European elections. May I also congratulate you on being attentive readers of your emails, because we sent out the invitation only last night. It was all arranged over the weekend and yesterday, and so we were not sure we would get as many people in the audience as we had on the platform. In fact, we weren't even sure we'd get as many people on the platform as we have on the platform. But anyway, you are all here. I would say we may not have quantity, but we have quality. And I very much look forward to the discussion. I'm not myself going to talk at this point about the elections. I shall feel free to intervene at various points and maybe say something towards the end. But I want to, before I introduce the speakers, I'm going to point out that the latest issue of the magazine, the Hungarian Review, which is our magazine here at the Danube Institute, contains a number of articles that are directly relevant to the European elections. It's available here, and I hope you will take copies of it. I particularly recommend 3 articles. One is by Theodor Dalrymple, the distinguished journalist, writes for the National Review, for the Wall Street Journal, for the City Journal in New York, for the Daily Telegraph, for the Spectator, and for many other magazines internationally. He has written a piece about the recent conference on migration that took place here. It's a good account of what the conference said and argued, but also it gives a very good picture of the migration situation as well. Secondly, we have an article on human rights and political wrongs by the distinguished British historian and political theorist Sir Noel Malcolm. He has written a very original argument on human rights and the way they are now expressed and defended in law. And I think that's fairly unusual to be able to write something that is both original and extremely sensible. Quite a lot of original articles that aren't sensible, but it's quite an achievement to have written something original and sensible on a topic which has been so well ploughed elsewhere. And then thirdly, our regular contributor, Nicholas Parsons, has got a review of the recent book by Eric Kaufmann, a book which has been very well received in general. And he has an extremely acute and powerful review of it, a favourable one, incidentally. It's not a hatchet job, but it is a very strong and effective review of ethnic politics in today's world. So all of these matters being relevant to the election, of course, including my own editorial on the question. So what I'm going to do now is to simply say that the election has taken place. It produced some surprises, and they went in both directions. There were gains, substantial gains, and what you might call consolidation for some of the parties entitled, I think the correct phrase these days is now national populism, national populist parties, including here in Hungary and in Poland and elsewhere. At the same time, the gains were not as dramatic as some people had hoped and others had feared, and that was interesting because there was ground for gains here, since the decline of the mainstream parties of left and right continued in both in France, in Germany, most dramatically, of course, in England, where the governing Conservatives got less than 10% of the total national vote, an extraordinary result. And what filled the gap? There was a gap left by these parties. It was partly filled by national populists, but it was also filled by an upsurge not in all countries, and there are quite important national divergences, but across Europe there was something of an upsurge of both the Greens. They came second in France, second in Germany, third in France. No, maybe the other way around. And the liberal and the ALDE group of liberals, which did very well, particularly in England, where they threatened the Labour Party just as the new Brexit National Populist Party threatened the Conservatives. So there's a very rich territory here. I'm going to invite our 4 speakers. You have the descriptions of their lives and careers in front of you. I'm not going to read them out again. We know all of the speakers, but here for the first time we have a distinguished Danish journalist who lives in Hungary, and we look forward to hearing his remarks later. Each of the speakers is going to cover a particular aspect of the topics, but also everybody is free to join in on a general discussion or to dispute and disagree with each other, and later you'll have the opportunity to join the debate too. So, having said all of that, many thanks for coming. Let me turn first of all to Mark Higgie, a former Australian ambassador to Brussels, the EU and NATO.
Belgium and Luxembourg also.
Belgium and Luxembourg also. An Australian diplomat in Europe has a lot of ground to cover. Anyway, so I'd like to invite Mark, who's an old friend of the Institute, to begin the discussion. Mark.
Well, thank you very much indeed, John, and thank you very much for the invitation. What I thought I might do is just do a quick run through the headline results. I suppose particularly focusing on the what I call the anti-open borders or anti-immigration conservatives. I don't. One hears the term far right. I agree with Douglas Murray's reservations about using that term. I think that should be reserved for open fascists, which most of the parties in fact, all of the parties we're talking about aren't. But so just in terms of the looking at the numbers from what happened. In terms of those anti-immigration nationalists, the first point is that they won in the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovenia. Quite a long list. They also made substantial gains in Sweden, Belgium, Germany, Finland, and Spain. It looks like we had a status quo result in Austria and the Netherlands, where one group was knocked out, but another one's come in at more or less the same numbers. And then finally, two countries give a little bit of comfort to the EU establishment, Denmark and Slovakia, where the anti-immigration nationalists went backwards. I see that the argument in relation to Denmark is that the ruling Liberal Party has so comprehensively embraced the policies of the People's Party that they managed to destroy the differentiation and hence their success. Slovakia, I think, is more related. Probably Borisz knows more about Slovakia. I think murky issues of recent murders, corruption, etc., which has propelled this new centre-left party head of Smer. Anyway, so those are that sort of presents the general picture. And as John mentioned, there are some interesting shifts and some unexpected ones, and one of those is that the expectation was reasonably widespread that these parties that I've just talked about would do much better. Some people in Brussels were talking about 1/3 of the vote of the European Parliament going to these parties. I wonder a little bit if that was a straw man being set up, but no, they're likely to get around 20% of the vote, and that somewhat more modest result than was expected has caused a lot of relief in a lot of the mainstream media and in the Brussels institutions. But I'm a little bit reminded of the election of President Macron at the beginning of 2017 against Marine Le Pen, which of course came against the backdrop of 2016, the two big blows to the liberal order, Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, and the euphoric sense that one got that the march of the right had been halted and things were being turned around and nice normal people would be in charge again. But it seems to me that any such reactions are overblown. the results that I've just talked about seem to me very much in a continuation of the political pattern we've seen in Europe since the great migration crisis of 2015, of voters using any opportunity there is to punish the ruling parties, and while not always putting these anti-immigration conservative parties in power, certainly advancing their position at every opportunity. And that seems to me to have happened again. The opinion polls show that if you look at the issues that concerned Europeans, still in 2019, immigration is the #1 issue that people care about. So that is clearly at the forefront of people's minds when they go out to vote. Not enough to cause a complete upheaval in the European institutions, but the change is nevertheless clear. As I mentioned that 20% of the seats are likely to go to the anti-immigration nationalists, conservatives. Now that obviously means that the Parliament will continue to be dominated by people who believe in the EU project, even though the mainstream centre-right and centre-left has gone somewhat backwards. There is still a solid majority for the project. The interesting thing will be what impact the increased strength of these parties will have. They will be louder. They will pursue more vigorously the view which they broadly share, that with the one exception of the Brexit Party, of course, that while the European project is basically a good thing, they think that too much sovereignty has been ceded to Brussels in the past, and that nation states should be given more sovereignty again over key things such as borders and immigration. In many ways, questioning the outcomes of those treaties from Maastricht to Lisbon, which transferred so much power to the Brussels centre. Another thing that I think will be interesting is how this trend, which we see again, translates into what in some ways will be a more important set of events at the end of the year, and that is the replacement of the current Commission with a new team. And of course, if we go back to 2014, there was very much a cosy consensus amongst the 28 on what sort of vision they had of Europe, and it was basically continuing the march towards further integration. This time it's going to be very different, with quite a number of countries taking a very different view. I'm to choose one particularly important example. The then government of Italy, run by Prime Minister Renzi, chose Federica Mogherini as Italy's commissioner, and she, of course, became in charge of EU foreign policy. I think Italy under Salvini in the driver's seat will choose a much more interesting candidate to go to Brussels this time, so we can see some fireworks coming. Not only with whoever Italy chooses, but the swag of East Central European countries, possibly Austria, depending on what happens there. So I think we can look forward to the repercussions of this continued shift being felt in big decisions in those changes at the end of the year. I might just finish with a few comments about the British result in particular, which was, it won't be a surprise to anyone in the audience that the Brexit Party is a phenomenon caused by the failure of the British Conservative government to produce Brexit after almost 3 years of negotiations and palpable frustration in the electorate. about that. Quite understandably, Nigel Farage and his team have achieved a phenomenal result, beating all the other parties. It's interesting that I noticed there's a new hashtag on Twitter, which is Remainer Maths, and this refers to the people who say, well, even though Brexit beat all the other parties very, very clearly, if you add up Change UK and the Greens and the Lib Dems, they outpolled Brexit, and so therefore they really won, which is I don't think anyone really accepts. But the I mean, and the other thing worth saying, of course, is that Theresa May chose as the day of her resignation Friday, before these appalling results came out. And of course, this mood swing in the United Kingdom and these results will very much propel the direction of politics in Britain over the next few weeks as they ponder who should succeed Theresa May. And I would argue that the key element there is that is that the view in the Conservative Party is that we need somebody who can beat Nigel Farage, which probably rules out people who are not so well known, who don't have much of a profile, who haven't delivered a record in terms of winning elections, and Boris Johnson is the obvious candidate from that point of view. I might just leave it just with a quick word about the Social Democrats who have performed. I mean, the mainstream centre-right has slipped, as you mentioned, John, but the Social Democrats have possibly even more spectacularly across Europe. And for example, the Social Democrats lost 3/4 of their seats at the last Dutch elections. Little notice because these European elections were taking place on Sunday, but there was also a state election in Bremen, which the Social Democrats lost for the first time in 73 years. So I might leave it there.
Good.
And leave it to others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And now I would like to ask Borisz Kálnoky, the correspondent in this region for Die Welt, and an experienced observer of the Central European and German scene, to address the general topic, but perhaps devoting some time particularly to the region and to Germany. Borisz.
Right. Well, this election was about the future of Europe, and the future of Europe that question can be rephrased as to what place does Germany want to occupy in Europe, and that is, we don't know. The Germans are still working on trying to have a strategy. No one knows really. And the one takeaway from these elections is that Germany will become weaker in the EU, because both traditional parties, the Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democratic Party, will become smaller in the two mainstream blocks of parties in the European Parliament. And we may well see the Spitzenkandidat of the European People's Party, a German as well, Manfred Weber, go down in flames before this week is over. We will see. So one point I would like to dwell on is not the balance of power in the new European Parliament, but the balance of power of nation states within Europe, starting from Germany, because this is the key really. Does Germany want to hang on to German-French cooperation as a motor of European integration? Does it want to embrace a strategic partnership with the Visegrad Group, perhaps, where all its industry is located and who shares the same basic economic philosophy? Or, as Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has hinted, will there be some sort of going together between Germany, France and the Visegrad Group? It seems inconceivable at the moment, but I wouldn't be so surprised if these countries get together and try to hold something against the philosophy of the southern European states who hold a different economic philosophy. So for Germany, let me tell you about two strange things that happened in the weeks before the elections. We had huge demonstrations every Friday, triggered by a 15 or 17-year-old girl from Sweden, I think, Greta Thunberg, that we should save the planet, school kids demonstrations. Nowhere in Europe did that have as huge an echo as in Germany. And Chancellor Merkel then went out and said, it's a very good thing for them to do that, and she agrees with them, but we may have to wait 30 or 40 years before we can see any results of her attempts to save the planet. The worst thing she could do, because conservatives were appalled that the Chancellor of Germany was writing pupils a letter that they don't need to go to school on Fridays. And she was telling the kids that you're all very nice, but by the time anything happens, you'll be the age I'm now. And I think that satisfied no one. Then a week before the election, a rapper, I wasn't quite sure what a rapper is until then, but a rapper by the artist name of Rezo published a video on YouTube saying we should destroy the CDU and the SPD because they are doing bad things to the climate. He as well. He had never done anything on politics before. He had done, well, some people call it music. And that video was clicked 3.5 million times within a few days and resulted in a completely panicked reaction by the CDU, who first wanted to come out with a reply video of their youngest member of parliament, and then decided not to because it was just too awkward, and then decided to do nothing, essentially. So these two things showed us that there were going to be problems for both mainstream parties, and the election results show that there's actually I think there's a paradigm shift in Germany. The traditional parties, as all over Europe, this is coming late to Germany, but in Germany as well, now the traditional parties are dead, they just don't know it yet. There's nothing they can do about it, it's a cultural thing. There used to be a time when people read one newspaper, voted for one party, held one job all their lives. These times are gone. What party I vote for, that used to be part of someone's identity, that's gone. People read the internet now, and all kinds of things are on the internet that doesn't have a worldview or a direction. They zap television programs, but they have stopped zapping television programs because now they watch videos on YouTube. So, and there's nothing really the mainstream parties have to hold against that. And it's not even so much about issues, it's about, well, let me come to a very strange analogy. Turkey, why is Erdogan so successful in Turkey? And one analyst put it quite succinctly. He said, Erdogan is what people see when they look into the mirror in Turkey. When men look into the mirror, that's who they want to be, and he resembles them. And women want a husband like that. Is strong, holds things together, protects the family, etc. Maybe there's a bit of this in Hungary when people look into the mirror.
See if you're all about.
Now, in Germany, we didn't have that kind of father figure, but we had a mother figure. We had Angela Merkel. And she was affectionately called Mutti, mother, and it was a standing phrase in German conversation, everyday conversation. Not a problem, Mutti will fix it. And that really disappeared in the migration crisis. Mutti doesn't fix problems anymore, she creates problems. With her gone, there is no face anywhere that anyone recognizes in the new generation. And this is where the Social Democrats have their biggest problem. I think they scored best with a generation beyond 70 years of age. So when we don't have these fixed identities anymore, political identities, it boils down to issues and emotions. The CDU, Christian Social Democrats, are very bad at emotions, and the SPD, Social Democrats, are very bad at issues. The one party that really two parties that combine them both very well now are the Greens and the AfD, the so-called National Populist Party, and they are fast becoming the two new main parties, almost the big parties, the Greens in the West and only in the West, and the AfD in the East and only in the East. It's really interesting. The Greens score in the big cities. And even in Eastern Germany, in the big city of Dresden, the Greens won. So it's not AfD who ruled there. If you go into a little bit more detail, we will see that CDU and Angela Merkel actually understood this problem 15 years ago. And that's when the CDU changed its whole strategy, and it gave itself a general secretary by the name of Peter Tauber, who decided that the CDU needed to become more diverse, more colorful, and more feminine. Everything the Greens are. But it didn't work. They benefited maybe 2% by this new strategy. But on the other hand, they opened up to the right. They left a huge space on the right into which the AfD moved. So why did it not work? Because the CDU doesn't have the faces, doesn't have the characters, it's not believable for the young generation. And there we are. The CDU tried to imitate the Greens, opened up a space for the AfD. CDU cannot be the Greens, and I think there's not much they can do. We will see this process go on. Meanwhile, it means Germany is politically fragmenting, and that leads to weakening of Germany in the European Union, and that's what I would like to say in these opening sentences.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's what you said about the CDU not being believable leads me to just mention a similar case in England when 2 years ago Mrs. May was hoping to make the Conservatives look more progressive and dynamic and so on. It was announced that there was going to be the appointment of younger people to the top. Well, the problem is that youth in everyday life doesn't mean the same thing as youth in politics. I mean, the people who are young in politics tend to be in their middle 30s at the earliest, some of them in their 40s. So if you're a 16 or a 20-year-old English person or Scot, whatever, and you look at these people, you don't immediately think, oh, they're just like me, because they're nothing like you. They're politically ambitious people who've been trying to become Prime Minister since they were 10, which you probably have not wanted to do. Anyway, so thank you very much indeed. Now I'd like to turn to Eszter Soós, and welcome again, Eszter. Obviously, after your amazing analysis of the French political situation on the last meeting we had you here for, obviously I'm hoping you'll be dealing with France in particular, but of course the floor and therefore the entire field is yours.
Thank you, John, and it's always an honor to come to the Danube Institute. I'm very happy to be here. At my introduction, I'd like to raise 5 points. The first is that even if Emmanuel Macron obviously lost this European parliamentary election by no more than 1 point, by the way, he's in a rather comfortable domestic situation. The reason for that is twofold. First of all, his main opponent is still Marine Le Pen. It was strategically important for him to keep it that way because Marine Le Pen is a very convenient foe, if I might say so. She's the kind of opponent he wants to see in the second round of the 2022 presidential election. Because if Marine Le Pen is his opponent again, he can say to all moderate electors that, come on, vote for me in order to block Marine Le Pen's way to the presidency, and take a look at the result of 2019. She might even win, so you really have to make a move and vote for me. So the presence of Marine Le Pen and even her victory is not at all deterministic when it comes to 2022. It's a convenient situation for Emmanuel Macron. Second, it's also a convenient situation for Marine Le Pen. Of course, her party, for the second time in French history, won the European parliamentary election. I'd like to remind you that the National Front won this election in 2014, and they just won it again. But Marine Le Pen is also interested in having Emmanuel Macron as the main opponent to her. The reason for that is that both Macron and Le Pen try to reorganize the French political landscape. The, let's say, so-called ancient political landscape was organized based on the classical left-right cleavage. The new landscape that they want to install is based on a so-called globalization or integration or transnational cleavage. It's a new social situation where globalization, European integration, and all issues related to borders, be it cultural or economic, are part of the political debate. In this framework, classical parties like the Socialist Party or the neo-Gaullist Republican Party doesn't really fit in, or let's say they do not really find their way in this landscape, because these electorates and these parties, program-wise, are divided. If you remember the election of 2007 or 2012, these parties had to work with double messages because their electorate was divided based on Europeanization and globalization. So, message part one to those who are pro-European and very comfortable in globalization, and message part two to those who are rather uncomfortable in globalization. This is the reason why these parties imploded so easily when Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron decided to proceed to this reorganization of the political system. What I'd like to underline is that in this case, Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen might be opponents, but they also work together in order to reorganize French politics. This is very important to understand. They need each other. The second point I'd like to raise consequently is that this new cleavage, this globalization, integration, and transnational cleavage is strengthened. The first time when this cleavage was dominant was 2017. Obviously, the old parties, the Socialist Party and the Republicans, are counter-interested in this change, so they wanted to make a comeback. It didn't succeed. Emmanuel Macron and his party En Marche, and Marine Le Pen and her party, the National Rally, managed to take one more step toward the stabilization of this new party system. Interesting things, therefore, happened under 15% at the places where the Socialist Party collapsed again, and where the Republican Party had only 8% of the vote, roughly. 8% is extraordinarily low. Opinion polls gave 13%, roughly, to Republicans. 2/3 of the Republican electorate said that they were sure of their choice, and 1/3 of this electorate said that they were unsure. It means that 1/3 of the initial electorate of the Republicans went towards either La République En Marche, so Macron, or the Greens, or Marine Le Pen. It means that the space is narrowing for the Republicans. Third point, there is an increasing interest in European politics. This is a consequence of all that I've just said. Participation in France, like in other countries of Europe, rose to a level that hasn't been seen since 1994. Fourth point, just about the campaign, La République En Marche did a very, I wouldn't say bad campaign, but it wasn't beneficial for the République En Marche. They chose Nathalie Loiseau, a former minister in charge of European affairs, to lead the list of the party, En Marche. Let's say that she wasn't put there, and she wasn't chosen in order to be a good campaigner. She was chosen for her technocratic skills, her knowledge of the issues, and for the work she can do in the European Parliament. She was not a brilliant candidate on the campaign trail. Partly this is the reason why Emmanuel Macron had to implicate himself in the campaign at the end. During the last, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks, he had to come out and campaign very actively in order to limit the damage to the list of En Marche. Let me remind you that the National Rally began to lead opinion polls 5 or 6 weeks ago, so it's a really late development. Next point, Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen is officially a political survivor now. In 2017, you remember her performance in the presidential election. In the second round of the presidential election, it was not a catastrophic performance. It was a historic score for the National Front, but the National Front thought about it as a catastrophe. And Marine Le Pen was in a very dire situation. Some talked about the end of her political career. 2 years afterwards, we can say that the party survived. She managed to recreate it, rename it, and rebrand it, and her electoral victory means that she survived this very turbulent era of her political career. So she's in, let's say she's on the move now. The impact of her victory will depend partly on Emmanuel Macron. For 2 reasons. There is a competition of interpretation now in Paris. That's normal. After every election, parties try to interpret what happened. But secondly, Macron has an advantage. He's president of the French Republic. So today he's gonna go to Brussels. He's gonna dine with other European leaders. He will have to say something about the Spitzenkandidat system. He is in disagreement with Angela Merkel on that. So if he manages to use his capital wisely in Europe, and when I say capital, I mean the number of seats that the ALDE and its alliances won in Brussels, then he might regain some of the authority he lost in Paris. It's entirely up to him. However, this is let's say, a short-term thing. Short-term thing because Germany and France now tend to disagree on many things. I cannot imagine a Europe going forward to realize great ambitions without the agreement of these 2 countries, so he will have to work on that. From a domestic French point of view, this is just a tactical thing. Everything will depend on the next 3 domestic years in politics and policy. We will see about that. I think the main message is that he lost. His loss, let's say, is limited, and that nothing is decided in advance when it comes to the next presidential election. For now, Emmanuel Macron is the best placed candidate to win the next presidential election, but Marine Le Pen and others will have a say in it. We will see how other parties try to reconstruct themselves. There are serious mini crises now in small French parties. It's very interesting to watch the left reconstruct itself, and of course we will see how the right will try to salvage its existence in the coming years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eszter. That raises a lot of really interesting questions we'll come to later. I'd like to now introduce, first of all, I'd like to apologize to you all that our good friend Ulla Terkelsen, who was on the platform with you the last occasion here, Eszter, has had to cancel at short notice. She has been sent off by her head office to report on the Austrian political crisis. So we completely understand that, but we hope to have her again. Now, I'm delighted to say she's been able to she's been able to invite on our behalf. The next speaker, who is a Danish journalist living and working here in Hungary, author of a recent book, Orbanland, and somebody who brings a fresh and interesting gaze to politics here, but also, of course, is able to tell us on one of the more interesting results of the elections, namely the one in Denmark, where the national populist cause suffered an actual setback, apparently, rather than simply not gaining as much ground as it had hoped. So, Litta, may I ask you to speak to us?
Thank you very much, John, for inviting me and coming here with very short notice to try to fill out the shoes of Ulla. I'll do my best to talk a little bit about Danish politics, Scandinavia, even though normally I'm mostly handling Hungarian politics. But so what happened in Denmark was that maybe you might remember 5 years ago that the Danish People Party won a record result with almost 30% of the votes. This is a right-wing nationalist protest party that had grown into, for I think 14 of the last 18 years has been in the national elections, been the supporting party of the center-right government, dictating a lot of the strengthening anti-migration politics that we have seen in Denmark. So I'm going to do a little bit of comparisons with Sweden and Denmark between those two countries because I think that's very, very interesting to look at. But what happened this weekend was that the Danish People Party was reduced from these 28-29% 5 years ago to only around 10%, and no other right-wing nationalist party replaced them, like we saw in Holland, where another party took over those votes. So that's very interesting. I think one of the explanations for that could be that that both this liberal party, Venstre, which is the governing party, it's a center-right party. They have, of course, done a lot of compromises with the People's Party over the last 2 decades and adopting a lot of these anti-migration policies. Also, over the past couple of years, the Social Democrats, very interestingly, has kind of taken over the anti-migration politics. They have, shook hands with the right-wing populists to kind of try to make a deal about continuing this course of anti-migration policies. So what I'm trying to say is that the Social Democrats have adopted a lot of the right-wing rhetoric, so has this center-right Liberal Party, and that has resulted in this reduction of the votes for the national populists in the People's Party. To this story, it's very complex because at the moment we have a Danish national election campaign going on. The elections will be next week, and in this election, in the national elections, there are 2 new ultra-right-wing parties running for the parliament. So this might not be the case in 1 week, the same situation, because they might, take a lot of these votes from the center-right Liberal Party. It's very complex. But let me move on to the comparison with Sweden, which we Danes, we like to compare ourselves with the Swedes because we think that we are better at debating the hard issues like migration, whereas the Swedes are more politically correct. And you might dispute this, and I'm ready to discuss this. But the explanation for that could be that we have had this Danish People Party as a supporting party for the government for the past 2 decades. They have been, let into the debate. They have been taken seriously by the normally more liberal Danish mindset. We've been able to have some very tough discussions One could mention the Mohammed Khatun crisis 13 years ago, which led us to having to debate these very delicate topics like Islam, migration. What can you say? What can't you say? Politically correctness, and these topics that are, still very dominant today in European politics all over. Whereas in Sweden, the Swedish Democrats, which interestingly tripled, I think, since the last European elections, they went from 5 to 15%. They have been more isolated in the discussion in Sweden. The center-right government party and the Social Democrats have kind of, looked the other way, didn't want to invite them into the discussion, and this is something that maybe have led to a more extreme views in this right-wing populist nationalist group, Sweden Democrats. Whereas the People Party in Denmark have, become maybe more mainstream, which can also explain that now, they're a little bit between two chairs. They used to have these more extreme rhetorics and policies, but they have now been adopted by the center-right and the Social Democrats. So it's all very complex, as you can hear. But if I come back in a couple of weeks, I will be able to explain this more, because the results of the national elections in Denmark will show us if these two new ultra-right-wing parties will gain momentum and kind of sustain this right-wing agenda that's been very dominant in politics in Denmark for the past 2 decades. One last point would be that I think Denmark was among only 2 or 3 other nations in the European elections where climate was the most important topic, not migration. Still important, but climate was very important for a lot of Danes, and we also had the young Swedish activist Greta Thunberg in Denmark the day before the European elections on Saturday. So that might have, there was a lot of media attention on that. The leader of the Danish People Party was, of course, very, very sad with the result of the European elections. She was having a speech after the result came out, and she was kind of in a bitter mood because they lost 3 seats in the European Parliament, and she said that I'm trying to find an explanation, but it's probably the fault of the climate fools. So that's the phrase she used. So I think, at least in Denmark and also in Sweden, and we've seen in Germany and other countries where the Green Party have gained momentum, that climate will dominate the agenda all over Europe in the future, and that could start out from Denmark. So that's what I can say about it.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Now, I'm going to ask each of our speakers a question about, based on what their remarks are, and then ask them if they want to comment on each other's remarks, and finally then throw it open to you. I'm going to actually take a point that this has just made and throw it to Borisz. I think that it's also the case in Germany that climate has replaced immigration as the single most important topic in the opinion polls in the last week or two. But that being the case, how do we explain this, in particularly in relation to Germany? Because hasn't there been a great deal, or has there not been a great deal of popular discontent about the impact on energy costs, both for industry and the consumer, of the fairly ambitious German policy of moving towards renewables? How do we combine these two ideas?
Well, let's go back to the idea that Angela Merkel in particular realized that there was a long-time trend evolving in favoring the Greens, and so she came up with this very sudden idea of getting out of nuclear energy, and that does lead to, I think, the most expensive energy prices in Europe for consumers. Germans are historically happy to pay higher prices if they save someone's life, or maybe some tree will be greener, or maybe more animals will be around. So I don't think the price itself is a big problem. However, now it comes to the point where not only we need to get out of nuclear energy, but what do we do with coal? And there's another plan to get out of coal by 2038, I think. That infuriates people in Eastern Germany, where we have a coal industry and many jobs depending on it. So, so in terms of nuts and bolts, that's as much as I can say. But I think this whole climate discussion has nothing to do whatsoever with any factual, material issues. I think that it's just an atmosphere. It's a generational malaise du siècle, and that's where it finds its expression. But what it represents is perhaps something like the 1968 movement, where it didn't really matter so much how reasonable the things are that you say. It's just that you really stuck it to the old stupid idiots.
So it's an awakening if you favour it, and it's a moral panic if you don't.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I turn to you and ask about the candidate for the European president, a European president, and that you mentioned was something which where the French and the Germans disagree on. I wonder if you could go into that a bit more, because it's not only a symptom of difficult relations that might develop, but also it's a symptom of the way in which what has been previously a kind of almost unknown bureaucratic little row has now spread to a fairly major problem afflicting several countries, including Hungary.
Yes. So Emmanuel Macron has been a vocal opponent of the Spitzenkandidat system, while Angela Merkel herself is said to be a skeptic, but nevertheless she toed the line, so she supported Jean-Claude Juncker in 2014, and this year she is set to support Manfred Weber. We will see, by the way, tonight, who supports whom at the council meeting. The French have a not-so-secret favorite for the position of the President of the European Commission. He is Michel Barnier, the current Brexit chief negotiator of the European Union. He belongs to the EPP, the European People's Party. Macron doesn't really want to question the electoral victory of the European People's Party. He wants to take back the prerogative to the Council to be able to choose whom to nominate and put forward in Parliament. The allies of Macron in Parliament, ALDE Plus, already issued a statement questioning the Spitzenkandidat system and quasi-questioning the nomination of Manfred Weber. So this is an open struggle in Parliament. Let me draw your attention to the fact that it is possible to forge a narrow majority with the Greens, and it is possible to forge a narrow majority with the Liberals. So it's also a game where political parties try to put themselves in the best possible position. Obviously, this is a very complex chess game, so I will not be able to predict the results of this chess game. But I think every day we are going to see a little bit clearer, because now there will be meetings where everybody will be forced to kind of show their cards. So I'm very much looking forward to the position of President Macron, and by the way, Angela Merkel, because I think she's still a key player, but we don't know how weakened she is in Berlin. Maybe Mr. Kálnoky could enlighten us. But I think that her position is not that clear. The CDU won this European parliamentary election, but scored a historically low number of votes. So I think these things are interlinked, and let me reiterate once again, with every day we are going to see a little bit clearer.
Thank you. Litta, I want to ask you, develop an argument about Denmark's friends and allies in European politics. I remember in all the years when Britain was still obviously going to be a member of looked like being a member indefinitely of the EU, the British were always hoping that to have the Danes and the Dutch on their side to bring about a so to speak, less regulated, more free enterprise, less political Europe. And it's fair to say very often these two countries and one or two others were on Britain's side, but it never made the slightest impact on the locomotive of the Franco-German alliance. At least if it made an impact, it was really a marginal one, and the main direction of politics carried on. I mean, who does Denmark now look at in post-Brexit Europe particularly as its allies, and on what grounds?
Right. I think that's a very interesting question because so we have 13 seats in the parliament. After Brexit, we will have 14. We've always been very close with the Brits because, you know, we've both been a little bit skeptical about this European integration. You know, Denmark has these 4 reservations, so we are not fully integrated in 4 areas of the European Union, including on the euro. But who's going to be our new friends? That's a very good question. I think it's very open, and we still need to have to see clearer, like you phrased it, Eszter. Everything is very chaotic, and if you look at what parties, what groups in the European Parliament that the Danish mandates are in, we have only the one People's Party in this new Salvini group. We have one conservative in the EPP, and then the rest is in ALDE and in the Greens and the Social Democrats. So looking to Germany would probably be the most obvious one, but I might add that, you know, the most popular commissioner in the European Union is Margrethe Vestager, the Danish commissioner for competition. She is not a Spitzenkandidat for ALDE, but she is, you know, because ALDE doesn't support this process, but she is. She was in the debate between the Spitzenkandidats, and I think that she could be the one who could, you know, try to take on this role as president. Maybe I'm looking too much through my Danish class right now, and there's a lot of attention on that, of course.
But she's obviously a major figure now in European politics and EU politics, and I mean, she's a leading figure in several senses, both leading the EU's position on taxation of major companies, but at the same multinationals. But at the same time, she's also increasingly, it seems to me, in the last few days, the public face of the liberal surge in the elections. So, so she has a real future in European politics. Could she end up as winning this particular battle to head the either the European Parliament or become head of the Commission in the new system? Because, after all, most of the existing figures are now either getting on, like Jean-Claude Juncker, or they're compromised in some way.
That's right, and what she phrased, I think, last night was that she, with this liberal surge, she was saying, we finally broke the 2 blocks of the European Union, the EPP and the Social Democrats, and she wants to take on this role of being this compromising figure. That, of course, depends a lot on the EPP, because there are some disagreements with this very pro-Europe pro-EU policies that especially ALDE has. So, yeah, I'm very curious to see how this development goes. Even tonight, we might be cleverer than we are right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Let me turn to you, Mark, as the last, so to speak, follow-up question. This is really about the impact of these elections abroad, I mean, outside of Europe. If you were writing in your old capacity as ambassador, what advice would you be giving the Australian government, a new government in itself, which has just won an election, about how to deal with the new shape of European politics?
Well, I think the first thing to be said is that a lot of the political shifts that we've seen in Europe in recent years very much echo other parts of the Western world, and I think what happened in the United States and also Australia, where our left, our Labour Party, has tried several times to pursue what it calls a progressive agenda on various things, more radical change on climate change, looser approach to immigration, and the voters keep voting for the continuity of the existing centre-right government. I was interested actually with what you were saying about Denmark and climate, because in Australia the recent election became in many ways a battle between greater activism on climate and jobs, and jobs won. And this was all about whether coal mines should be new ones should be started up or not. So the trends are, to answer your question, John, are familiar ones to say Australia. But then I'd have to, probably somewhat more boringly, I would say that despite a lot of these interesting shifts, including greater favouring of the anti-immigration nationalists, the EU project, for the moment continues, and Australia's key interest at the moment is negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU, and there's no reason to think why that doesn't continue. But with a word of caution, and that is that people wonder, will the EU project just sort of go on indefinitely? Clearly these elections don't challenge that. But I do think, if you think of the things that might bring the whole thing down, chaotic immigration, I think, is one thing. What happened in 2015 had a huge impact, and I would argue we're still seeing the aftershocks of that. And what happened, of course, was that even though Angela Merkel never said, sorry, I made a terrible mistake, I think she said something like, it was the correct decision, but I won't do it again, or something like that. And that's what's happened. I mean, they've claimed it was the correct moral decision and so forth, but at the same time, no one complained when the Macedonians closed the border with Greece, and the deal was done with Turkey to stop the boats coming, and the Italians did things with the Libyans and so forth. And there's a lot of shouting about what Italy's done to stop the migration coming through, but I think probably a lot of people aren't too unhappy that the flow up through Italy has actually come to a close. So I would say that were such mistakes to be made again, that does risk the whole European project, that the countries would, Schengen would start really seriously shutting down, and you would have the anti-immigration nationalists further strengthened, possibly to the extent of wanting nothing to do with the whole Brussels project. So to answer your question, no great drama in the short term, but there are warning signs there for the future.
Thank you. Now I'm going to ask a couple of questions more, which I will put to particular people, but the other members of the panel are free to jump in if they wish. My first is to you, Borisz. How will Viktor Orban react, in your view, to the results of these elections? He did very well in Hungary, indeed, in fact, probably most successful result of any party. But at the same time, will he be disappointed by the overall picture of results?
He may have hoped for a somewhat better result of the Salvini group and other conservative national movements, the national conservative movements. He may also look at Slovakia and Slovenia and see that he lost 2 or 3 deputies there that had counted as close allies of Fidesz in the European People's Party, in the EPP. So the block of deputies that stand with Orban within the EPP may have become a little bit smaller, will become a little bit smaller in the next European Parliament. Well, he needs to see where he wants to belong to. I believe it is best for him, and he still regards it as being best for him to remain in the European People's Party. But of course, he cannot look a beaten man, and it would not be good for him to be member of a parliamentary group where he is held in quarantine, and no one will ask his opinion anymore about anything because it may be dangerous for him to speak. So the best solution for him would be for Manfred Weber to fail, and then this whole dual situation between Weber and Orban would have gone to his favor, to Orban's favor. Then to push Michel Barnier, for instance, get the French to like Hungary better.
That'd be easy.
Stick it to the Germans because he strengthens Macron against Merkel. Split the German-French cooperation, or at least fissure it a little bit, all the while saying, look, this is not about hurting French-German friendship. This is about us needing to stand together with the Visegrad group and be the new center of Europe because we are the people who have the soundest economic thinking, things like that. So I think that would be the best way forward for him. Is it possible for him? We will have to wait and see.
Anyone else want to come in on this?
I wish I could add something, but I'm also very curious to see how this will go.
Good. No?
He's got a temporary ally on this in Macron,
Yes.
the person of Macron, so maybe they can strike a deal.
Yes. Now, my next question to you all, beginning, however, with Eszter, is this. When I saw these results come in, my first thought was, look, this is interesting. We're going to have a more diverse European Parliament with perhaps more shake-up of authority. But then, as was predicted to me by the Polish MEP, Richard Legutko, he said if the duopoly of centre, right and left loses its majority, which it's now done, it's got 43% of MEPs, not more than 50, all that will happen is the ALDE group will be brought into the coalition, and I think some people now would say the Greens as well, possibly. And if so, the governing duopoly at the centre, which has, with the extremes isolated, so to speak, politics which has been described by the French political scientist, whose name has just gone out of my head, as populist demagogy versus the fanaticism of the centre. That seems to have been strengthened. I mean, it looks as though there'll be a large bloc which dominates the parliamentary arrangements, the business, the voting, and with, again, the people on the left and right with even less power than they had before the elections. Is that right or wrong?
Two things. As a response, first of all, even at this moment, we cannot be sure that these European parties will stay the way they are. Because Emmanuel Macron has a big ambition to pull some MEPs away from the socialist group, obviously the right wing of the socialist group, and to pull away some MEPs from the EPP, obviously from the liberal and left-wing side of the EPP. So first of all, I would say that let's wait until the, how do I say, the smoke goes up in Rome?
The smoke clears, yes.
The smoke clears. Because until the day the parliament starts its work, there might be some changes. And the second is that I'm not sure that from a French point of view and from the point of view of Macron, I'm not sure that he wants left and right to remain like this. He would like to create the same dynamic at the European level that he created at home. That is to create a pro-European bloc and to create a more sovereignist bloc, let's call it like that. So he has the same common interest, for instance, with Viktor Orban to reorganize European politics. And this attempt, I don't know whether it's going to succeed or fail, but in this game, obviously the EPP and the socialists are also counter-interested. So even if they are in an alliance, even if they have a majority together, Emmanuel Macron wants something entirely else. So he'd like to break the classic dynamic of European politics. He wants to politicize, make the European politics more conflictual. It's a completely different concept of European politics. I think the next 5 years is going to be about that, not only for Emmanuel Macron, but obviously for Viktor Orban and others, because there are social movements and tectonic movements that pave the way for this party system in Europe, but obviously this parliament is, even if it's more diverse, it doesn't really change the main logic of European politics. It's kind of a transformational parliament or something like that. So I think we are living a very, very interesting moment of European politics.
Well, just a British codicil to your answer. If the British don't ever actually leave, if Brexit doesn't happen, won't this make Nigel Farage one of the most important players in the reorganisation of European politics you were just describing?
It might as well happen, because the same globalization, integration, cleavage is at work in Britain. Brexit is all about that. So if somebody wants to create European politics based on this idea, and when and if Britain is in the European Union, they are a player.
Thank you. Any other people on that particular question?
Yes. A few questions on France, if I may, Eszter. I was interested that you thought that Macron hadn't come out of this too badly, these elections. But once Salvini came on the scene, Macron was very keen to sort of set himself up very publicly as Macron and Salvini representing the opposite poles of competing for the European soul. Now, I would have thought, given Salvini's fantastic result and Macron comes second after Le Pen, he's got a bit of egg on his face, I would have thought. But I did. So that's one. Number two, you didn't mention the Gilets jaunes, and I'd be interested to know where their votes went, if any. And if I may, a third one, you say that Macron would back Michel Barnier, who is EPP, not where Macron would. Is that just because he's French? Simple as that?
Yes. Short answer, yes.
I think this is easy, yes.
Yes, okay, yeah.
Yes.
Let's maybe, but I mean...
you first.
Let me put it as a question to you then. Am I wrong to think that the French pioneered the strategy of having good people in key positions in European structures as the whole adventure began, and the Germans learned from them and went on to be more successful than the French in that, and Macron maybe would like to return to that kind of strategy?
Or maybe Germany is now emboldened During the last 15-20 years, the European balance of power changed. Now Germany is not overtly in a hegemonic position, but everybody knows that the powerhouse of Europe is Germany, politically and economically speaking. I'm not sure that the French like that. François Mitterrand is credited with saying that we love Germany so much that we want two of them. Which is a sign that for France, this Germany might be too big, too powerful, but that's how it is. Coming back to the Gilets jaunes question, because this is very, very interesting and very important. The lists that were overtly linked to the Gilets jaunes movement, the Yellow Vest, fared below 1%. It's negligible. Other lists who allied themselves with the Gilets jaunes also come under 1%, which is obviously, again, negligible. When one takes a look at the political preferences of the Gilets jaunes, two parties come up as dominant parties in their preferences. One is La France Insoumise, the France Unbowed movement. They fared pretty badly, 6.5 or something like that. And Marine Le Pen and the National Rally. It's very logical. It is very logical because the Yellow Vests are the people who are uncomfortable in globalization. They are uncomfortable with the way the economy is organized. They are uncomfortable with immigration and all the cultural and economic aspects of globalization. They are far from, let me use this word again, the economic powerhouses of France. So these people find a political home in the National Rally because the National Rally kind of reflects all their problems and questions. The radical left doesn't reflect all their problems. The radical left is pro-immigration, for example. So I think that those few percentages that Marine Le Pen and the National Rally gained at the end of this campaign that might be linked to the Gilets jaunes. But let me tell you one thing that is very important. The Yellow Vests are against representative government. So they are critical of representativity. So it's a tricky situation.
Anarchists.
I'd like to just make a point here, comparing what you've just said and the way in which politics has moved on from the old left-right arrangement is perhaps moving towards this new cleavage between sovereigntists on the one hand and integrationists on the other, but hasn't yet arrived there yet, and still a lot of movement going on. Well, by looking at this situation in relation to the British election results, because what you see is both, as in many other places, both the major parties, the centre-right Conservatives on the one hand and the centre-left Labour on the other, have suffered very badly. Of course, you could argue the centre-left has suffered partly because it's become so detached from the centre. What has happened to the voters in this election? Well, first of all, one of the things that happened was the Conservative vote went down from, I don't know what it was, the previous election was probably about 30%, but it went down to 9%. Now, most of those voters apparently went to the I would say, National Conservative Party, which is what Brexit really is, or National Populist Party. That is what it is, and they have gone. They've got 32%, and you can add another 4% to them from the UKIP, the people who still voted UKIP a bit. Okay, you've got those. You've got the Labour Party losing most of its votes to the Liberal Democrats, and on the one hand, and to Brexit on the other in the north. So the traditional Labour voter is going to the Conservative, or to Brexit, or to a form of populist conservatism. The centre, the genuine centre-left vote is leaving Labour, at least in this election, and going to the Liberal Democrats. Both major parties are squeezed, and and their supporters are going in different directions. It seems to me that, bad though the position of the Conservatives and the right is here, it's better than that of Labour and the left. for this reason, that the division that is being suffered by the Conservatives, that can be mended, but anyway, those voters are going to another Conservative party. What's happening with Labour is its traditional heartland is disappearing rapidly. On the one hand, and yet the people who are left are not homogenous middle-class intelligentsia of the progressive left. Some of them are quite soft centrist liberals on the one hand, and some of them are radical Marxists on the other. So, which in a way is a little similar, I believe, to with the French situation of the French left. So the division of the right is not, it seems to me, as well, there aren't as many divisions on the right as on the left, which is actually quite common in political history. But there is nonetheless, there are serious divisions in both. And it will take some considerable time. Well, maybe it will take one election, but for the British system to resettle as having a Conservative party on the right, which is a national populist party, which is, as everybody now says, who's not completely inattentive to facts, everybody now says that Conservatives have got no choice. They have to be a Brexit party. That's what they're about. If they can't, their own supporters will go elsewhere. So they might get a kind of, you might get two Leave parties, with one of them being larger than the other. On the left, it's possible you'll have 3 or 4 parties. And so one can't really foresee how the British political system is going to shake out. But if that particular point is right, then I would imagine we might well see Brexit. Although, you know, this is the third division, which I haven't talked about, is that between the politicians and the voters. And there's no doubt that that's a very important division, and one which means that the politicians will try to prevent there being an election for as long as they possibly can until these things have been sorted out. Well, now, are there any points that people on the platform would like to respond to that their colleagues have said? Would any of you like to respond to?
I would
yes.
like to add something about this division or polarization. It's a very dominant topic in my book, Orbanland, which is not only about Hungary, it's about Europe as a whole. So I try to lift up this discussion between the national conservatives, populists on the right, and the liberals and center-left, the progressives. And I think you were mentioning this, like how the European Parliament could be reorganized. And I think maybe not tomorrow and maybe not even next year, but in the years to come, I think we will see a new kind of organizing of nationalist populists on one hand, and then the progressive liberals on the other. And the interesting thing about that is the division, because how can they cooperate, and what's the percentage of each bloc in each country? Another point could be that you would have the yellow vests in that one group, and you could see more and more maybe of these climate fools, like the Danish People Party leader said, climate activists, very active in the other progressive group. So you might see 2 new topics, clashing, migration versus climate, and this is of course down the road, but it's also about identity, as we talked about, and I think that would be interesting to see how that division would take place if it will develop like that.
Thank you very much. If there are no questions between the members of the panel, no? In that case, let me now ask people from the floor if anyone from the floor would like to ask a question. Yes, gentleman here.
Hello. Excellent discussion. Thank you very much. You all addressed, to some extent, the changes going on in the specific countries, including Britain. But in a wider sense, as an American, I see what's going on in American politics also, where there's the left And the Tea Party was on the, let's call it the nationalist right, years ago. There, the Republican Party with Trump and the Tea Party is more or less, I think, is accommodating them somehow, where the Democratic side is still not clear what's happening. So in Denmark, the comment was that the lead party accommodated some on the right and has absorbed more or less their issues. And it's going on in France. I'm particularly interested in Germany. Where is that headed? Are we headed in the same direction? Or is Germany going to be different? And are these changes going to be permanent in your mind, Borisz, or is it a phenomena that will pass and in 10 years it's back to some sort of normal socialist conservative split?
Right. Obviously, Borisz, you go first to
Right,
that.
okay. I think socialist and conservative, these two terms have lost a lot of their meaning. Yes, it's true that right-centrist parties, the Christian Democrats, have been very good under Angela Merkel at simply soaking up all the issues that social democrats could possibly field, and it's one big reason for their decline. They're now trying to find their way back to a more traditional leftist stance, but that alienates another group of voters because they're coming up with ideas like let's have political control of all the big corporations, big housing companies, let's take away all the real estate that they control and rent it out for less money. So private property gets put into question here. And so there's a lot of movement on the left, and it may lead, as you say, to more splits. I don't think we're coming back to socialist, conservative. I mean, these are terms of the past, really. Probably this globalist, sovereignist divide is more relevant, and the way I see it, really. Look, democracy, market economy, and the nation state all came hand in hand politically because of an economic transformation. And I can, although we tend to think that this is the end of history and it will always stay the way we know it, I can very well imagine that all three of them will not be with us anymore due to another economic transformation sometime down the road. Now, the key question, obviously, with regard to globalization, is we have these huge global companies. How do we regulate them? We can't let them regulate us, right, or rule us. So, and the two approaches clearly are, because they are transnational, we must have transnational decision-making structures because these companies are too big. But if that just doesn't work, because we can't get our act together, it's not practical, it doesn't function, then in fact the sovereignist reflex at the moment is the same as the integrationist reflex. It's a question of how to regulate the global economy, and if it's more efficient to regulate it on a national level because it has more democratic legitimacy and it's quicker. You can come to and even you may want to see a strong state with more central authority, a la Orban, because it enables it to act quicker and more decisively. So I think these are two sides of the same coin.
Yes, very interesting. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. Oh yes. Next question. There was a gentleman at the back.
Hello, Alexander Stemp.
No, I'll go first.
Okay, hello, Alexander Stemp of Budapest Times. I've got a question that might not necessarily fit in with the conversation of today, but it's a sort of future security question, and I want to sort of put this to the panel, but to you, Eszter, in particular, who's obviously a specialist in French politics. Seriously, with sort of Russia, Ukraine, and European relations, it's like Marine Le Pen would be quite happy to give Crimea, to the Russians, as it were, but the rest of France and sort of most of Europe is sort of saying, no, you can't. But all this is enough to sort of, yet again, split Europe with two divided opinions. Do you have any sort of thoughts on sort of future security and sort of relations issues, you know, sort of relating to Europe, France in general for the future? Thank you.
I just had to think about it a little bit because in 2022, I think, and I think I'm reiterating this, the main candidate to win the presidency is still Emmanuel Macron. In a latest poll, he is credited with 55% of the vote in the second round. It's a narrower margin than in 2017, but still a very considerable one. First of all, I think from a security point of view, there are two things we have to pay attention to. One is border control. The debates around Frontex, they are still open, and the recreation of the Dublin regulation is still on the table in the Council. It's an open question. And second, Emmanuel Macron has big ambitions when it comes to the European army and to European defense, so we have to pay attention to that. Obviously, that is still a work in progress. So these are the two main questions I'd like to draw your attention to. When it comes to Marine Le Pen, there is one thing why I am very reluctant to make any predictions. First of all, she's a pragmatic. She's pragmatic. After 2017, she kind of did a U-turn. She completely redrawed her European policies. In 2017, she said 70% of her program cannot be done if France remains in the Eurozone. Now, leaving the Eurozone is out of the program, and Frexit is out of the program of the National Rally. So her position, like the position of many pragmatic politicians, by the way, so it's not her specialty, depends on the state of French opinion. So I cannot really predict it. Now, obviously, French opinion is not very friendly to Vladimir Putin and Russia and all that. So these are the factors I would pay attention to without making any concrete prediction.
But it's enough to provoke, you know, and you've got those sort of North Street oil pipeline sort of somewhere on the horizon too. So these little things sort of coming to the surface, you know.
I was just going to add a very quick question to that, and that is, does anybody with the name Le Pen have a chance of being elected French president?
The traditional response is that when hell freezes over.
Yes.
But I think that both Jean-Marie Le Pen and, most importantly, Marine Le Pen are politicians who are traditionally undervalued. The political work that Marine Le Pen managed to do since 2017 is spectacular. And by that I mean that she was a political dead person, and now she's back. So those who say that she cannot be elected are the same people who said that the ceiling for the National Front was at 15%, at 20%, now it's at 40%. So the ceiling is going up and up and up. So the traditional response, the Republican response, the response that says that this is not France, says no, never, no way. Even the question is insulting. But I think the political reality is that Marine Le Pen is a strategic and pragmatic politician who survived many things, and I wouldn't undervalue her capacities. So her chance of becoming president is higher than 10%.
Thank you.
John,
Maybe Theresa
John,
May
don't-
should take
don't
a
worry.
correspondence course.
Don't worry, Trump can never be president.
Good.
Yeah.
But let me just spread the earlier question from Alexander about defence. Does anybody else want to talk about the effect of these elections on plans for a separate European defence, allied to but outside of NATO? Anybody at all?
Of course, the hope is that they fail. I mean, I mean, having worked with NATO for 3 years, it just seems absolutely absurd that the majority of European countries that don't meet the 2% defence target, which was agreed, are talking of spending new resources on separate parallel structures, which are not necessary. It's just and it's a mystery to me that this has got as far as it had. But I think there's still, quite a bit of resistance around Europe.
We have another person who's worked on this question.
I would beg to differ strongly. I also worked at NATO. I worked in the Western European Union a long time ago. And we are not talking about different structures. They're the same people, same equipment, maybe one headquarters more, but NATO has so many headquarters that every 5 years they restructure, create headquarters, get rid of headquarters, so I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is a question of sovereignty, and that comes into the discussion we're having today. I think that personally I find it a pity that we got rid of the Western European Union, because that was an alliance, and I think ideally, I'm not for a European army, because that doesn't make a lot of sense, because you need, first of all, you need a political unity. You have to give up your complete defense and security sovereignty to have a European army. I would like to go back, I mean, if you look at it ideally, at the 1950s. In the 1950s, NATO basically told the European countries how many and what type of units they had to have. You had, for the army, for example, there was a Landsend division, which was a standard organization, and so everything was really interoperable because it was all American equipment, and with a couple of exceptions of British Centurion tanks. Denmark bought it, Holland bought it, but most of the stuff was American, and the organization was completely the same for the French army, for the Belgian divisions, for the German divisions. So that, I think, is what we are talking about. We're not talking about a European army as such, and I think that often this concept of European defense is reduced to a European army, and I don't think anybody is really talking about the European army. And I think that's a problem of interpretation, a problem of perception.
Thank you. There's another question, gentleman right at the back, who raised his hands much earlier.
And one intervention, I was at a conference and a German general was discussing this European army. This was after Kosovo. And I went up to him afterwards, I said, where will you get your material? He said, from NATO.
Yeah. You've been okay. You've waited a long time to ask your question.
Thank you. But I have two questions.
Okay.
So the first one is that there will be new High Commissioner for Foreign Policy and a new President. President Tusk was very fond of give the British the chance to change their mind. He was a very pro-Baxter. Will be the change according to the new European Parliament in this policy? What do you think? And my second question is that politics is always a mixture of rational politics and ideology and emotional politics. And now it seems to be a shift for the emotional and ideological policy. But the European Parliament always seems to be a base of the rational politics. Will be a great change in the European Parliament in this sense.
Who would like to respond to that?
John.
Yes. Would you like? Let me issue an instruction.
I didn't quite follow the first question.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I think that there's a slight misunderstanding on our side of the table.
Would you just like to rephrase your first question about the High Commissioner for Foreign Policy?
there will be new High Commissioner for Foreign Policy, and there will be a new president for the European Union. And obviously, they will come from possibility that they will come from the new, from the Greens or from the ALDE, from the new party groups. And there will be a change in the foreign policy generally from the European point of view. And second, there was President Tusk had a very strong will to give a chance to the Brexit. So will it be continue or will be a change in this policy?
Well, on the question of the identity of the next EU foreign minister, the High Commissioner, I mean, my understanding, and others might correct me on this, is that the process is that the first step is that you identify the new president of the Commission, and that person then makes the allocation, drawing on whoever's been proposed by the 27 members. So I don't think there's any inevitability about the political orientation of that person. In many ways, it's who has the best claims to, I suppose, expertise in the foreign policy area. It just so happened that Mogherini was the one last time. I don't think there's any inevitability, but others may have a stronger sense of how it works.
I'm not sure. I don't know how it works, but in a general way, I do think it may feel difficult for most participants in Brussels to have a Green member in any such position. Regarding Tusk, showing leniency, a degree of understanding towards the British wishes for yet another prolongation, I can very well imagine that this will change. But really, none of these questions can be answered now. We have to wait.
I think that's largely true. But
just one little thing. There are 4 top positions to distribute: President of Parliament, President of Commission, President of Council, and High Commissioner. And normally, most of these positions are decided in a package. So that's where country balance of power, political balance of power might come into question, but I'm also skeptical when it comes to a Green High Commissioner, but I might be surprised.
Well, I suppose the other thing we're saying is that it's very hard to imagine that any of the member states would propose a former Green politician as their representative in Brussels. That's hard to conceive.
We can turn the question around, actually, and ask, the Greens now have power, actually, potential power, and we can turn your question around and ask, what effect will that have on the Greens? Will they start reflecting on what to do with that power? Will it change their political DNA, the way of thinking and acting? That's an exciting question.
Yes, the rise of the Greens is, which really started, didn't it, in the 80s in Germany with Petra Kelly and the peace movement and so on. The Greens were part of that same development. That is on the verge here of revolutionizing the whole of European politics. I mean, in all sorts of countries. I know there are some countries where they haven't yet made an impact, but I'm inclined to guess that that's simply a matter of time before they do. But if they do, that has tremendously important implications for Europe's competitiveness in economic and trade terms with the rest of the world, because as far as one can gather from the rhetoric of some green movements, not all, they're more or less indifferent to the economic impact of the restrictions they want in order to bring about a very different climate world. I mean, the most obvious one being that very small additions to carbon persuade them that they have to close down industries at the same time as China and India are building power stations that are pouring far greater amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. So I have to think that the arrival of the Greens in these elections is a really major element in European politics, and of course one that's going to have impact on relations between Europe at the centre and individual countries like Poland, which like East Germany, has got a lot of coal and doesn't want to find that its successful modernization of its economy and development of its fossil fuel industry is going to be really blocked or retarded. So we see a kind of world political row in European terms emerging here. I think this will have to be the last question, since two of our speakers have to leave on the dot. So would anyone like to ask a final question? Gentleman here.
Just a general question, if I could ask you to finally sum up who have been the winners and losers in the elections. From what you said, it sounds there have been some shifts, but it's pretty much business as usual. The ship will correct itself in general. The biggest impact I've seen is Jeremy Corbyn agreeing to a second referendum. He's desperately trying to recover the Remain voters back to Labour, for example. So who are the winners and losers overall?
I'm going to ask each of the panelists, beginning this time going from right to left, to answer the questions, and any other remarks they may want finally to add later.
Well, I think the progressive liberals can say at least they have gotten some more momentum, even in this country. The name of the party is Momentum, and that was maybe a surprise to a few of us that the opposition in Hungary was shifted a bit like that, at least to me. So I think the ALDE group and the Liberals will have a stronger position going forward than they have today.
I tend to agree. Liberals and Greens are kind of victors, and then when it comes to other positions in Brussels, the classical we'll see.
Thank you. Boris?
Well, I'm not going to go with parties. I will try to point out another element. I think that two sides that clearly, one in profile in these elections is the countryside and the big cities, each in their own way. If you look at the vote in Poland, in Hungary, in France with Rassemblement National, a lot of countryside voters there who didn't really participate in European elections earlier to a great degree, all of a sudden they have their voice heard. So I think that's a major new development. On the other side, the Liberal and Green vote is concentrated in the big cities. And so it's countryside against city, as I see it right now, across national boundaries and across party lines.
Thank you.
Well, in terms of the winners, it's impossible not to mention Nigel Farage and Matteo Salvini. They're obviously two very big winners, but the Greens as well. And I was just going to add to what John said before about the influence of the Greens, that you a bit like the anti-immigration right, their influence sort of seeps to their left, to the mainstream centre-right parties. With the Greens, you mentioned Angela Merkel saying to school children, yes, it was fine to have their Fridays off. In that case, and also Greta Thunberg went to London recently, and interestingly, she was invited to address MPs in the Houses of Parliament, which Donald Trump is not being invited to do. But Greta Thunberg gets that. And not only that, but one of the candidates for the Tory leadership, Michael Gove, said after he met Greta Thunberg that he saluted her leadership and said, she is the voice of our conscience. A potential leader of the Conservative Party. I mean, this is, shows that if Tories say that, it's interesting. Anyway, thanks, John.
Well, I'm just going to sum up this way. The political changes we're looking at are really quite interesting, dramatic, and they go in different directions. But in general, it seems to me, major political changes occur in response to crises. Now, a crisis can be real, really affecting people's lives, something that makes them deeply anxious in the most everyday sense, or it can be an imagined crisis. I say imagined, not imaginary. There may be some basis to it, but it doesn't really have a deep and practical impact on the way you live and what you think your future is going to be like. So a housing crisis, for example, is a real crisis. But you can think of crises, maybe some foreign policy crises, which don't really matter to you when it comes down to it. I think here that we have a choice of crises. On the one hand, we have the national populists pointing to the crisis of migration, which has slightly calmed down for a minute, but which a lot of people think is going to resume as a crisis. And that, I think, is impelling voters to those parties. And you have the crisis of world climate. Now, then that may be in a scientific sense a crisis. Is it a deeply felt crisis that you think will impact on you and your families? Some people think that, of course, others don't. Which of these two crises is going to be the winning crisis, so to speak? That, I think, is what we're going to be finding out in the next 10 years. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Eszter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you.